So let's start with the next part, which is the fetch. Fetch. Let me show the slides. So fetch, it's our first step towards backend. Until now, we have done mostly frontend. JavaScript is common, so it's a language. It can be used for backend and frontend, but we have seen mostly frontend. We have seen DOM manipulation, some frontend frameworks. And now for the next couple of weeks, we will see some of the things that make the backend engineering, the backend programming. And Fetch is not really yet backend, but it's our first step towards it because it will connect us with APIs. And APIs, it's a way of interacting with other programs, with servers, with getting data from the backend, from a database. So Fetch will be our tool to get data from somewhere else. Could be our data that is hosted in our server that we have created, a backend server with some database and with some data, and we will do that actually next week. Or we could be getting data from external sources from other servers. In any case, data is it's what moves the apps. So if you have data, you can do nice things. If you don't have data and you have to create everything from scratch, it's very complicated. There are so many APIs out there that you can use, and you can do beautiful stuff, and you can create different programs. And so having access to data and being able to get them and show them and use them, manipulate them and everything is what will give us more tools to create nicer things. And so for this, we need to learn our main tool for connecting with data, which is this fetch method. So the slides, I will try to go quickly over the slides because the code, at least from the slides, it's not very helpful. So we will see more examples on code after the slides that will be a bit more clear. Yes, I think most it's the examples, the code examples that we will see later. What we will cover with the slides and with this topic today is what is an API, what are the HTTP methods and status codes. HTTP is a protocol that we will be using when we want to communicate and grab some data, communicate with servers. How do we use this fetch method, this tool? And how do you handle asynchronous data? So this is also a quite important part. We have not seen this until now in JavaScript, but whenever we were doing something, it was done one after the other, and it gives us the vision of having things done in a synchronous way. Everything was happening like instantly. But when we have to discuss about connecting with other servers that can be located in the other side of the world, then we always have to calculate for some delay. And this will produce this asynchronous effect. That's not everything will happen at the moment that I will click something, but then I need to wait for something to happen. So let's start with an API. API, it's the initials of API. It means an application programming interface. It's an interface, so it's a way to connect and to communicate between applications, between programs. So simplified, if we have one person and another person and they want to communicate between them, they have some kind of rules, they have some kind of protocol that says that one will ask for a pizza, and this can be translated to Bob sends a request for a pizza, and then who has pizza will answer this request with a response. So basically this will be the response. and will send back in a response, it will send back the pizza. So we have this request response. And we have set some rules for this, how exactly the request has to be, how exactly the response has to be. So the format of this request and the format of this response. And the same happens when two applications or two programs and two machines, they want to communicate one with the other. So in our case, we have our application and we have somewhere a database that holds some data. And your application, my application, will be sending a request for data via an API, this interface that will help us define exactly how will be the format of the request, so that the machine understands which data I need to give back, if you are authorized for getting this data. So important information like if you have authorization for this, some security and control checks, and what part of the data exactly you want, and then send back the data through a response so that you can use and modify and show as you like. So APIs helps communicate and the two systems and help them understand exactly what you want so that you can fulfill the request. And it's also a way for companies to share part of information while maintaining some control and some security. So we can find APIs in almost anything nowadays. So for example, Instagram may have an API, Facebook may have an API, Spotify has an API, IMDb has an API. So offering an API, it's offering like a small window, a small door to external programmers, developers, applications to access your data. But of course, Facebook doesn't want to have like an open door to come on in, get anything you want, I don't mind. So it needs to maintain some control. So it needs to check who is accessing the data and what part of the data. I can show you maybe, I don't know, some user information, but not all of the user information, because some of that information is sensitive. So I need to be able to show only one part and hide another part from my data. So it's on the interest of the companies that they open some of their data, because like that, other programmers can use this and create applications with them. And so this adds also value to these other companies. So if you create a nice application using the Spotify data, Spotify also wins, because then it also gets some popularity. And there are also, of course, APIs that are paid, because if you want my data, then you can pay me something, some subscription, and then you can use my data. But of course, you cannot open up everything. And so there are controls for access, and an API is this mediator, this interface between the two to control how to pass data from one to the other. A bit of a vocabulary that we will be using is, we have a request and a response. So the client and the server, we have this typical architecture of computer networks that is a client and the server. The client sends a request and the server responds with a response. And both in the request and in the response, there is one part that is the body and one part that is the headers. The header of the request and the body of the request, the header of the response and the body of the response. You can think of it similarly to what we had in HTML file. In a simple HTML file, you remember we have like the head part at the top, that is some metadata, some information, the links, or maybe showing which is the author of that, but this information doesn't really show on the page, so it's not the actual data. And then we have the body part of the HTML, which is the actual data that we show on the screen. So similarly here, we have the head part, which is some meta information, authorization, passing, which language we are going to be using, content type, if it's going to be JSON, if it's going to be text, if it's going to be something else. And so we have this header part, and then we have the body part where the actual data from the database is coming back as a response. So normally the request is going to be having mostly headers, because when you ask for something, you don't have any body, and the response will have the body of the data, unless you want to write to a database. So for example, I'm a user, I want to register, and I'm sending you a request for registration to your service. So I'm sending you some information, my username, my email, my name and surname, my telephone. So all this data will go to the body of the request, and I'm going to send you a request for registration. So normally, so data is not only coming one way. So it's not that we only get data from server. Sometimes we also have to pass data to the server. So it's always a request goes from a client to the server. So even if we pass data to the server, it's going to be a request. It's a request for posting data, for sending data to the server. And then the server will respond with a response, will be like, okay, I accept it, or you are not authorized. So we can have some information on what's happening. And this information comes in the status codes. HTTP, it's the protocol that is being used on the internet for communicating between clients and servers. And so HTTP protocol, it's, as you see, it's the one that we put when we start writing a URL. We put HTTP and then something, something, something. So that means that we are going to use this HTTP protocol, and I'm sending a request. So when I'm doing this, I'm sending a request to a server. The server is the local host right now, it's hosted here. And I'm sending a request to the server to send me an HTML. So in fact, when I write this, a simple URL, I'm saying to a server, send me, I'm doing a get of a URL. So of course now my local host is not working. Let me just check. HTTP hypertext transfer protocol. It's this protocol that is used on the internet for communicating between a client and a server. And let me see here. So when I want to see anything, I want to take like a URL, for example, google.com. What I do is that I type http:/google.com something, and then just also some other language that we are not going to do a networking class, but so that you have in mind some things. So everything in the internet is marked by an internet address, that it's IP address. Okay, I don't know if you have heard this term before. So every machine has some internet address that it's called IP, Internet Protocol. And so when you are making a request to a server, so for some information, you may be writing google.com, but machines don't understand google.com, and so they need to translate this to some numerical address. So for this translation, we use something that is called a domain name server that makes this translation. So when you say, I want to see google.com, there is first, your service provider will check with a domain name server to see how this name is translated to an address. So translates google.com to its address. This is the real address, let's say, so not this one, but the real address, machine address of Google will be this number. And then you will make a request to this number. It will go somewhere on the network until it arrives to the Google server that is somewhere on the other side of the world. And then the opposite way will come back the response. And this communication will happen using this HTTP protocol. So HTTP, let me check the status codes, codes, response status codes. So we have different methods, or maybe first check the methods and then the status codes. The request methods. So we have different methods for communicating with this protocol. The most common is the GET method that requests access to some data. Then we have the POST method that submits to a specified resource, submits some data. So we have GET, we have POST, the most common of them. We have the delete, so there are many, but the most common are these: the GET, the POST, the delete, that we request to delete something, a specified resource, PUT, that will be replacing, so this will be used for modifying. So these 4 are the common ones. You have some other here, but the common ones are the 4: GET, POST, PUT, and delete. So when you do a HTTP request, you need to specify first what kind of action you are trying to do. If you are trying to get some data from the other side, or you are trying to post, or to modify, or to delete some data. And then the other side, so the server, will respond with some status codes. So depends on if they start with 1, with 2, with 3, or 4 or 5. So we have 5 categories of codes. The messages that have a code starting with 1 are just informational messages. The ones that start with 2 are successful responses. The 3 messages are redirection messages. The 4 ones are client errors, and the 5 ones are server errors. I'm guessing you may have seen, or you are familiar with some of these. So for example, the typical 404, that it's like resource is not found, or website is not found. So when you try to ask for a site that is not there, so then you get a 404 message, which is a client error. It's considered a client error because it's not that the server could not respond, is that it's like you have asked for something that doesn't exist. Okay, so you can check the different responses. For example, client error responses: 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized. If you need some login and you have sent a bad login, etc., you may get a response from the server, 401, but you are not authorized to get this resource. 402, payment required. 403, forbidden, because it's similar to unauthorized, but it has some difference. That it's not that I don't know who you are, it's that you are not allowed in here. So 401 means that you have not sent me your credentials. 403 is that even that you have sent me your credentials, you are not allowed here. 404 is this typical one: the server cannot find the requested resource. We don't need, of course, to know them all, and we will just work with 5 among all. So maybe with the unauthorized 404, the 200 will be the okay status. And so, but just so that you know that there are many, if you get some response sometime and you don't know what it is, you can check the code and see what exactly the message means. And so normally we work with this one also. The 200 okay means that the request was succeeded, and you either got back some data at the same time with this 200 okay, so the server could respond with okay, and here is your data. Or if what you were trying to do is to add something, then it may be okay, I have added what you have asked me to add. So there are different messages. And so we have this communication, the client, the server, request, response, different methods: get, post, put, and delete, and different status codes that are coming back to tell us how it's going. And then we have this fetch, which is a JavaScript method, in fact, is a JavaScript API that is already installed in the browser. It's already created in the browser, but we will be using one of its methods that is also called fetch. That it's the way to allow us to do all this interaction. And the promise is what we will see also today. It's a new thing from JavaScript that we will see, is a way to handle asynchronous things that are happening in JavaScript. So how to handle asynchronous things. And so how does it work? You will send a request to the API server. You may need to include some information in a body, or you may just send the headers, the head part, the headers. For this request, you will use an HTTP method that could be this get or post or put or delete. You may also need to include some headers to tell the API server who you are or what you are trying to get. And then you will get a response from the API server with some information in the body and with a status code to tell you if your request was successful or not. And the way to do this when you are using JavaScript is to do it with a fetch, which will return a promise. Promise is something that the fetch is returning. It's a specific format of an object, of an asynchronous object, and we will see this a bit in just a moment. So fetch is something that we do with JavaScript. If you are using some other language, you may be using some other tool. And in fact, in JavaScript, there is also another tool that is called Axios. So in fact, instead of fetch, you could also be using Axios. Fetch is the one that was like pre-installed. It's a bit older. Axios, it's a newer tool that you can download and like npm install Axios, and you can have it running also on your machine. So this is just a tool. This other part, it's how Ethernet is working. So this is the HTTP protocol and the server client server communication. This is independent of which language you are using. Let's see if I can see it here. Well, we will see it when we'll do some API testing. Or let me just open the inspector. So here on the inspector, on the network tab, so on your inspector, you have elements, console, sources, etc. And you have one tab that is the network tab. Every time you try to click on something, so for example, if I click here on this link, then you will see a lot of activity because the page has to load, and that means that you have to get the image, and then you have to get the text and everything. And you see here that whatever you do, it gets some status, like this was a 200 because it was okay, which type it was, and from where it started. So if you actually click it, let's see how you can open this. You can see, for example, this thing that I have requested, one of the resources. It is an image, SVG. So this is the URL, the request URL. The request method was get, because I tried to get this image and it was okay. So I have a 200 status code. And then maybe there are some more elements. Let me see if I can make this bit so that we can see the rest of the information here. So we also can get some response header. Normally, we're not going to deal a lot with this part here, but there is some information, how much was the content length, when was the request done. So there is a lot of information here on the headers that we don't have to know now and we don't have to deal with. Normally, we will just check the status code to see if it was as expected or if we got some error. And if we have some body, then we will use the body part, which will be the data or the image, etc. But for you will see here on the network thing that for anything that you do, you have which method was used and what was responded. And then you have also this headers part. And then the response in this case was a JSON, or the response when I was dealing with the JSVG, the response, the body part, was the actual image that was given back to me. So on the network tab, we can have some information of what is happening. Now in this page, it has a lot of elements. We will see with our pages, we will have fewer elements, with more controlled. We will check this network tab again and see the information that we can get from here. So sometimes if we don't know what happened and in which step of the process something went wrong or was lost, we could check also this network tab to get some info of was the request done correctly, or did I get some error message that I didn't understand, or where was something happened or lost in the communication. So these are the methods that we will be using: get, to grab, collect the resource from a server; post, to add a resource; put and patch. These are similar. Put is for replacing an entire resource. Patch is to just update part of the resource. Normally we use put. And then delete, to delete the resource. These are the four or five that are the common ones. And in fact, these methods have an equivalence to the methods that are used when you are dealing with data in a database, and which is called the CRUD operation: create, read, update, and delete. This CRUD is the initials of these four types of operations that you can do with data. That is, that you can create, you can read, you can update, and you can delete. And then we have the equivalence of these four operations. These operations are done with databases. We have the equivalence of them with the HTTP method. So the create method would be the equivalent for the create would be the post. Okay, because it will be the one that will be creating a new resource, will add a new resource. The read method, the equivalent of this, it will be the get, because with the get method, we get a resource, we read it. The update method of the database, the equivalent is the one that is the put or the patch. So both of them actually are related to updating a resource. And then the delete is the delete also. So the API has this direct relation. When we are talking with APIs, we have a direct relationship with the database, where we are storing the data. We will see databases next week, and we will create our own databases, and we'll see these methods also, these CRUD operations.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So CRUD operation or CRUD operations, they are database operations?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So it's not it's for storage. Yes, it's for are the four basic operations of persistent storage. So it's not HTTP protocol operations. There are operations that are done with data, with databases. So when we say persistent storage, we mean a database normally. It's where we store more permanently data. So yes, this acronym refers to these operations, and then each language, so databases have different languages. This SQL or SQL, we will deal with how to name it next week, has its own way of doing these operations. And then maybe MongoDB, another database, has another way of doing this operation. But these four operations are common to all databases, that you need to be able to do these operations: create, read, update, and delete your data. And so here you also see on APIs, and especially on a category that we call RESTful APIs, we have these operations and the equivalent with the HTTP protocol that they use, the method that they use. As I was saying, create is the post, read is the get, update is the put, and delete is the delete. So the status codes we have seen the ones are informational, successful, redirection, client error, server error. The 404 is the one that is the common for the resource not found. The 200 is the okay. And the 418, it's actually 418 status code. It's actually a joke, a programmer's joke. I think it was created, the code that responds, I'm a teapot. And it was created at some point in history for as an April Fool's Day joke. And so it remains from then, since then it still remains, it's really a joke code. This is it 418, you can search it. And so you get this, I'm a teapot response from the server. So means I'm a teapot indicating that the server cannot brew coffee because it is permanently configured as a teapot. Okay. So fetch is our way of connecting or of getting things. And so the way that fetch works, the syntax of fetch, is that we have in parentheses, we pass the URL, the thing that we want to fetch. So the information that we want to get, the URL, the API that we want to connect to. And fetch returns a promise. So you will spend a bit of time later to check about fetch, but fetch returns a promise, and the promise in JavaScript, it's an object. The official definition of promise, it's an object that may produce some value later in the future, sometime in the future. So the value of this can be either resolved or rejected. So a promise can be resolved or can be rejected. So it's like I'm telling you now that I will try to fetch, I will try to do what you are telling me. This will take some time, wait for it. And so I will tell you when I'm finished, if I managed to do this, if I did not. So the promise is a promise, is I'll try to do this. And then you don't have the response instantly. You will get the response. And then when you will get the response with the dot then, this is the way of writing it, one of the ways of writing. We will see we have two ways of actually dealing with promises. So here I'm telling the server, try to get, not the server, I'm telling my program, try to get this resource from the server. So try to fetch this resource. And then if you manage to do it, then get me back the response. There is another part, if you don't manage to do it, then I'm dealing with an error part. So there is also not only a dot then, there is also a dot catch, which will deal with the error part. But so the idea is that the fetch returns a promise, and the promise, it's an object that either sends us a successful response, so it resolves correctly, or it's rejected. So something happens, it doesn't resolve correctly, and it's rejected, and so we get back some error message. In fact, the promise, it's an object that can be in three possible states. It's either fulfilled, so it's resolved, it's either rejected, or it is pending because it's still working on it. And the idea here is that we don't want to block our program. So we have this part in our program somewhere, this part of code in our program. If we didn't use promises, that means that while we're trying to get some data, the page would be blocked. The user would not be able to click anything. It will show as if it was frozen because it may take a minute or two to get back the data. And we don't want to block the execution of the program. We don't want to have it frozen. We want to continue with the execution while this runs like on the background. And so for this, we use this format, this promise that gets this code in our execution stack of our program in JavaScript. This code is moved outside of the stack, the program continues, and then when this ends, it will get back with some information, the response, the data, etc. But until it ends, until it is fulfilled or rejected or whatever happens, I can still continue running my program and doing things. So the program is not frozen. And so that's the idea, that we don't want to block our website or the code. So the promises have these two parts, the .then, that wait until we get a response and then do whatever it's in there. In here, we have a callback function in the .then. So don't worry about this too much. So the important thing is that in here, in the .then, we put some callback function, and that means that when I get a response from this, then do this. So some piece of code that is going to be in here. Otherwise, the .catch is also a callback function, and do this if I got an error, if the response was not successful. Here we have two .thens. This is a particularity of the fetch way of dealing with APIs. Normally in a promise, we have just .then, .catch. So a promise is either resolved, so we have a .then, or get some error, so we have a .catch. With the fetch, we need to break down our response to two parts. So we have like two .thens, and this is a common way of doing it. So we have fetch, .then, and then .then, because what happens with the fetch is that we get a response at the beginning from the server. So let's say that it was successful. We got the response with the resource that we have asked. So we get the response, but this response, it's unreadable from our machine. It's still in a format that is called like a string. It's not something that the JavaScript program can read. And so then we need a second step, a second part of this, to get this data and transform it to JSON format, so that then we can deal with the data. So we have this two-step process. We get the response, we transform it to JSON. Let me see if here, normally like this. So we get the response, we transform it to JSON format. I'll just tell you now what is the JSON format. So the first step is to transform the response to JSON format so that it's readable. And then we have the second step that we deal with the data. So here is where we actually have the actual data that we have requested in this second .then. Here we have the response from the server. We can check the status in this part here. We can check if it was okay or not, or if we got some other response, but we cannot yet read the data because it's an unreadable format, and we need to do this .json to transform it to some data that we could use. And since this action also takes some time, then we also need to wait for it to finish, and then so then we need the .then. So when this action finishes, then you do the next part. It's a bit confusing maybe at the beginning, but then you get used to it. And also we will see that there is another way. So this was introduced, I don't know if it was ES6 in JavaScript. So one version of the JavaScript, they introduced this format with the promises with the .then. And then even later in the ES8 version, they introduced a way of dealing with promises that it's even cleaner, I think. Instead of .then, it is the async await, it's called, and we will see today both ways of writing it. So before we continue with the fetch, what is a JSON format? We will be dealing a lot with the JSON format when we discuss data and APIs, because the way to send back information to us in a readable format for JavaScript is to use this JSON format, which is JavaScript object notation. The initials means JavaScript object notation. It's a way of transforming data to an object, like something that looks like a JavaScript object. It's an open standard file format. So there are others. There is the XML as well that was used before a lot more, but nowadays for websites, we normally use JSON. So it's a way to get data back in a format that looks like an object and can be readable from our programs. Let me see if there is a JSON. So you will see here XML, it's another way, JSON format. Okay, I don't know if it shows. We will see it also in many examples. You will see that it looks like an object. In fact, this is not JSON. No, this is not a JSON format. We will see it. This is a JSON format. It looks a lot like an object, just that we also have the key. So we had in objects, we have this key value pair. In the JSON, we also have the same thing. We have keys and values, just that the keys are also in between quotes. It should be used with double quotes. So we have in double quotes also this key part. And we cannot have as value, we cannot have functions. So there are some rules here on the JSON. It's basically a way of like showing data. You see, this is like an array of 2 objects, and each object, it's a piece of information, it's a piece of data with its ID, name, username, email. So there are some like, say, people objects, user objects, their address, which is another object and has some concrete information. So this is a way of getting back data, and then we process this as a normal array of objects. So this is readable from our programs, and it's an array that contains some object, and we can look through these arrays and we can deal with the object same as we did until now. So we have this JSON format, and whenever we get some response from the server, we normally get it in a JSON format. We can specify if we want to get something else. On the header, we can specify which format we want, but normally we get it in a JSON format, or we transform it to a JSON format, basically. We get the response from the server, and then we transform to a JSON format so that we can then deal with it. Okay, so what the user sees is that either we ask, for example, for an image, the promise was resolved and it was successful. So then you show the image, you load the image to the user. If there was an error, you can have a .catch to catch the error and show it again with some format, show at least so that the user knows that what has happened. We still need to show something, maybe an error, what the error was. And what also we can add, this is optional, it's not like part of the promise, but we can have a loading, something as loading, right? So that the user, if this takes a lot of time, it doesn't, she doesn't stays there wondering what has happened. If this has frozen or something, it knows that I'm getting your data right now. So we have some loading status while the promise is still not resolved in either as an error or with the concrete data. And we will see also different loaders. I will send you some resources so that you can use different loaders for your projects. So this async await pattern, it's a way to again handle promises in a different way than the .then.catch. So instead of .then, it waits for the promise to finish and then we'll do something later. I will show you this in code better so that we examine this. And so for a very good tool for checking APIs and for working with APIs is Postman. If you have not downloaded it yet, you can download it later. It's okay. We will be working with Postman, and so I have it here actually. And if you go to openweathermap.org, create an account and get an API key, we can practice different calls on these APIs. So I'm going to show you now this. Okay, so that's all for the data. So if you open, let me close this. If you open your Postman, we can see some example of how this works. Any questions before that, like from some of the other things from the slides? The concrete way of writing it on the program, we will see now the examples. So in different pages, for example, we have the open weather map. You can find that this server, this page, they offer an API. So they offer an API. It's a way that they offer you for accessing their data and using it. So if we click on API, it asks you for signing up, etc. But then normally we have a documentation of how this API works. And depends on the page, the documentation may be great or the documentation may be awful. So we need to learn how to search for the information that we want and read the documentation, the API documentation. In our case, in the Open Weather Map, it's a platform, it's a service for providing weather information for different places of the world. So, for example, they provide an API for getting the current weather data in some place, some city, and they have different formats. They can send it in a JSON format, in XML format, or in HTML format, and this is free if you get an account, a user account. Then you also have hourly forecast for 4 days, daily forecast, 16 days. So not all of them are free. We cannot use all of them. This is in some subscription plan. This is some other subscription plan. But this one, the first one that we will be using is the one that is free. So then here it has API doc. And normally it explains how to create this call for some information that you want from the server. How do you make an API call? And it explains how that you can use this first part is like the URL, the basic URL. And then there is a question mark. If you can see it, sorry. There is a question mark. That means that after the question mark, we will be putting some query parameters. So this will be like the part that will be changing, depending on if you want to check one city or the other, or if you want to get it in one unit type or the other, etc. So we have the basic URL, and then with the question mark, we have the query parameters. And so, for example, in this API, the query parameters are latitude, that you set some concrete latitude, and longitude. So the different parameters are separated with an and symbol. And the API ID, which is like your key, your user ID, the one that you get when you register to this platform. This is not some, well, it has some similarities, so APIs will have some similarities. All of them will be using this question mark for separating the base URL from the query parameters. And the query parameters, all of them are with an and symbol. But this API, for example, needs a latitude and a longitude. If I use a Spotify API, then maybe it will ask for a band name or a year or a song title or something else that will be defined in the API of Spotify. So I cannot know beforehand like how to write an API. It's not like I invent it. I have to go to the actual Spotify place, check the API, check which structure they use and what query parameters are optional or required, etc. So that I can use it and I can check it. So there is some example of API calls. So let's say that I put this latitude and this longitude and my API key. So I copy this. I have already have some API key somewhere in my mail. I had to register again earlier. So if you register on the Open Weather, you get your API key, and it will be something like this that you will need to use after where it says API ID. And you also get an API example. Here, instead of latitude and longitude, it also has like a queue that is this query for a concrete city. So this is another way of writing it. Not in this API, it will be in some of the other APIs, because they have many APIs and different ways of writing queries, either with latitude and longitude or with writing the city, etc. I think this is in some of the others here. Maybe this one. Oh, here it's again latitude and longitude. Historical, no, the historical, I think they are not free. Anyway, let's take this one. No, let's take the one that we got from with the longitude and latitude. I don't know which one is this latitude and longitude, but it doesn't matter. We'll see which we will get in return. So I'm copying this, and I just want to show you how to use it in Postman so that you see how we interact with this server. So in Postman, collections is just for grouping together different things, but you don't need to use it for now. We could just, with the plus, we create a new request. I don't want to save it, so it's an untitled request. So there are different things here to check. First, here we set which method we are going to use for our request. So if it is a get method, because I want to get some data, if it is a post method, this method that we referred to before. So if I want to send some data, then I change this to post method. If it is a get method, then I need to set this here. The default is normally get. So these APIs from the Open Weather Map, always they are get APIs because we try to get back some data. We are not sending any weather data to the server. So it's a get. And here you put the request URL. If I copy this URL that I just copied from here, I need to replace this API key that is in between the brackets with my API key. So I need to copy this and I need to replace it here. And you will see that actually these three query parameters are also shown here. So you can instead of writing the URL directly like this, you could also go here and write your query parameters. So Q, the city that is going to be London, and you'll see that automatically it adds it in the URL. So if I need to add or remove some query parameters, I can also do it in this part here. So it is a get method. It has this URL and some query parameters, that is the latitude, the longitude, and my key, my API ID. I can check on the headers. There are some headers that we don't really need to check. These are automatically created, like they mention who creates this request, that this request was created by Postman, what kind of encoding I'm accepting, some connection with the server thing. So we don't need to deal with this header. And the body part is empty because I'm not sending anything. I'm asking for information in this case. So the body part it's empty. But if we want to post some data, then we would come here to the body part and maybe put the data that I want to send to the server. So if I hit send here, I'm getting back a request. And here is the request that I got back. You see that there are different formats in Postman. It allows us also to see it a bit nicer, because if we see it in raw format, actually what we got back is this. The server tries to send back data as condensed, as zipped as possible. So this is a bit hard to read. But in Postman, you can see it like this in a prettier format, so that you see the JSON format. It's an object that we got back. And it has different properties. So one property coordinates, which is actually an object with the two coordinates, longitude and latitude, the ones that I have said. And then the weather data. So for example, that it will be clouds and other information, temperature, temperature minimum, temperature maximum, pressure, humidity, wind, clouds, a lot of information for this place. One thing to notice here is, for example, that it says that temperature is 275 degrees. And that is because it's, I think, the default, if you don't specify it, it's in Kelvin or something, the metric that is used. So if you want to use in Celsius, in metric, you have to go here in the API and check the parameters here, units. You can set, for example, in which unit you want the results back. So units of measurement, standard, metric, imperial units are available. So I think I need to change it to metric to see it in Celsius. So to change it to metric, that means that I have to put a query parameter that is unit equal to metric. So I'm adding a query parameter that is units equal to metric. It's called metric. It has added this on the URL, and now if I click send again, it will do the request and will respond with the temperature in Celsius. Now it's 2 degrees, right? 234 degrees, and some minimum and maximum, etc. So this is the simplest format, the get. We will see the get for now, because for now we'll just play with getting data. We're not going to post any data for now. And so the thing is that we need also to learn how to process this data. And this is like a nested object that is nested object, and maybe an array somewhere in between. So when you want, for example, to access this temperature, let's say that you got this data back and you want to access this temperature because you want to show it on the screen. How do you access this? If all this object is called data, it's what you get back from the JSON, then you will need to go data.main.temp. Okay, check that it is an object. So your whole object will be called data. And then you have like one property of it that it's main. So data.main will get you here. And then inside here is another object. So if you want to access this temp, it will be data.main.temp. So this will be a bit tricky until you get used to it. If I want, for example, to access this ID, I need to check which format I get the data back, because each API will send me different formats. It's not always going to be like one array or one object. It can be different levels of nestingness. And so if I want to check this ID because I need it for something, then this ID, see that it is, let's say that again, my whole object, I store it somewhere that's called data. So it's data.weather, but now weather, it's an array. Okay, and so I need to go data.weather, the square brackets, 0, because this is the 0 item of my array, and .id. So the complicated thing with JSON is that it is a mixture of arrays and objects sometimes, and then depends on which data part we need to access. You need to see how the server responds and where exactly it is stored. So that's why we use Postman to be able to see the data before we actually use it in the code, so that I'm doing some checks, I'm doing some testing, I see in which format I get my data and where exactly is the piece of information I want. And then I go to my JavaScript program and put this same URL, and I know already which format I will get the data back, so that I know what I'm expecting and how to use it, in which keywords I'm going to use, which property names I'm going to use. Okay, questions? I'm telling a lot of things today. I hope that you can then rewatch the recording if something is not really clear, but so I'm going to leave Postman for the moment, and let's do a bit of practicing with the fetch and the promises. So to see how this works. Let me see, I have some code here. So to understand a bit how this promise works, I'm going to do first an example that doesn't have to do with fetch, because promise is not only for fetch. Promise is something that exists in JavaScript, that whenever something will take time, we can put it inside the promise. So we can say that this it's going to respond, but later, and so deal with it in a different way. And let's say I have, so let's say I have an example, the pizza example. So I need to order pizza. So normally I have these 5 steps for ordering a pizza. I arrive at the pizza joint, I order the pizza, pizza is placed in the oven, then at some point I get informed that the pizza is ready, and then I leave with the pizza. So let's say I just want to console log all these things, and I have my function, get pizza, and then I just console log the different things. So 1, I arrive at the pizza place. Then I order. So if I do these things like this, they will happen sequentially. So if I just console log one thing after the other, they will happen sequentially. I will see if I run this function, I will see what's happening in my console. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3, pizza is in the oven. Okay. 4, pizza is ready. And 5, I live with hot pizza. Okay, so like if I get pizza and I call it, of course, I will see this happening 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The same order, nothing happened asynchronously because nothing needed more time than the other. Okay, so it's not that one console log takes more time than the other, and so one will happen after the other. It will happen in the order that I have them. The thing is that this part here, in the normal process, normally it takes some time, right? So it will not happen, it should not happen immediately, it should happen after some time. And to emulate that, I can use a set timeout. And so the timeout allows me to put some milliseconds or some, the time here is in milliseconds, so that this will happen after this time will pass. Okay, so I'm setting some timeout, and then after this timeout, this will happen. Because this emulates a bit the normal process that I order the pizza, but then I need to wait for it. If I now run the program, I see that I have them like in different order, 1, 2, 4, 5, and 3 happening later. But I cannot say pizza is ready and leave with hot pizza before I actually put the pizza in the oven. So I need to somehow wait for this to finish before I do these other actions. And the way to do this is to place this inside a promise. So for this, I create a promise. I will create it actually in a different function, so that we'll call this like make pizza function. And so this function returns a new promise. This promise already exists in JavaScript, is this object that will either resolve to something or it will reject. So it takes a callback function and it takes 2 arguments. It either resolves to something if everything goes correctly, or it sends back some other message if like an error message if it is rejected. So this, let's say, now that I don't have any reject, let's ignore the reject, it will always resolve. So my pizza will always happen. So it will resolve to pizza is in the oven. So this will happen. This promise will resolve to pizza is in the oven. And in order to emulate that this promise takes some time, I'm going to actually put the whole timeout in there. So this promise, it's not going to resolve immediately, because if now I do this, it will resolve immediately. It's not that it's waiting actually for anything to happen. It will resolve to, it will happen directly. It doesn't have to ask some data from the server or something. So even if I put it inside the promise can also resolve like immediately. In order to see the effect, I'm going to also add this timeout and say that when this resolves after some timeout, then I see this effect. So now here I just call make pizza. And so if I just call it like this will happen after some time, and I will still have the same effect. The code will continue, will not wait this function to finish. Okay, so if now I just call it like this, I still see 1, 2, 4, and then I should see 3. I need to console log this when it resolves. So let me just check it like this. Promise padding. I didn't get the third one. It's okay. I will. We will do it another way. We'll fix it. So the thing is that this part here, as I was saying, it takes some time and I need to wait for it to finish. So before I do this, because if I don't somehow declare that, please wait for this before you do the rest, then it will skip, the program will skip, will not wait for this, and I will see the things that I don't want to see before finishing the previous one. So that's why I put it inside the promise. And then one way of dealing with promises is with the .then. So this is a promise. So that means that I can say when this thing finishes, then do something and have a callback function and put this code inside my callback function. So that means that these two last steps will not happen until this step has resolved. So that I'm sure that I don't skip to parts of the code before this part that is taking more time resolves. Okay, so I will wait and then see these 4 and 5 when this make pizza resolves. So I see 1, 2, it waits, and then I see 4 and 5, because when this has finished successfully, then I'm getting this other 2. It doesn't skip to the next until this is resolved. So this returns a promise, and the .then waits for the promise to resolve, and then shows the rest of the code. We can actually in here get the resolve method. So I can say then get the resolve of the pizza. Let me try to console log it like this. This is a bit of a silly example, and so let me see if we are lucky. Okay, so now I see it correctly. So the resolve is what I get in return. When this promise is resolved correctly, I will get in return this message. So I can say that then get what has happened, how this has evolved, how it was resolved, and console log this, console log the other. So do it in this order. Okay, if I don't put it inside the then that means that it will not wait for this. If I have these two console logs outside, so if this, I had them here, as I had them before, the make pizza will resolve and will tell me something, but my program will have continued because it doesn't wait for these things that take longer. So I'm going to see 1, 2, 4, 5, and then I'm going to see the 3, which takes a bit longer. The resolve, the return of this promise. So a promise can have a part that is like successful, but it can also have a part that is what happens if it is rejected. And so let's see how we can also see the reject part. So the timeout, I'm still going to put it inside the timeout so that it takes some delay. I'm trying to emulate the delay that it will be when you try to grab some data. Okay, and so let's say pizza, let's say if I have pizza, then it will resolve correctly, else it will reject. So let's say if I have, or I don't know, some variable that maybe we can set here. Have tomato equals to true. Else reject. So if I manage to do what you are asking me, I will send you back in the resolve function. So I will send you back something, some error message, some correct message, the data. So here I could also set the whole data. That's what our server does. It sends back in the resolve all this whole JSON format. Or if I don't manage, then maybe I can send back something, can't make pizza, no tomato. Okay, so let's say that if I have this done to true, then I'm expecting this to resolve correctly, and then I'll try to set it to false and see what happens at the reject. So for this, I need to catch. So if it is resolved correctly, I just put these things happening here. I have this callback function. I call the make pizza, and then if it resolves correctly, I have this. Else, so the else part is the catch part. It will catch the error message. It will catch the reject message, and it can show me the reject message. So console log the reject message. This is my promise. This is the part that's taking some time. When it resolves correctly, it will respond with some message, and then I can continue and do some other things with my code. But if I don't manage to resolve correctly, I will get the reject part, and it would be like, can be some kind of error message that I can check this reject, check, and console log. So let's put this tomato to false and see what happens. I arrive, I order a pizza, and then I get a reject. After 2000 milliseconds, since I didn't have tomatoes, the promise responded with this reject part. And so I didn't get in the then, I got in the catch part of the promise. Okay, so there is one then part and one catch part. And since I didn't got the resolve, I got the reject message, I got to this second part. Okay, in fact, these names here, resolve, reject, they don't need to be these. These are just the variable names. Or you could just say res and reach or whatever you want, or error, it doesn't matter. So this means that when I will be rejected, I will get some response here, and I will deal with this response, like console log it. So this doesn't have to be named resolve or reject. Okay, and it still works. I get the same thing, I will get in the catch part. So this is how promises work in general. They have these two parts, the resolve and the reject. If something is as expected, so if I can manage to get the data from the server, I will get the resolve part, and then I will go into the then. If not, I will get the reject part, and I will get this part. Questions on the promise format? So this is with a .then .catch. There is another way of doing this, which for many it's a bit clearer, that instead of saying .then, we declare when one part we know that it will return a promise, we say that we will await for this part. That means that I'm going to wait for this to be done. So in fact, I'm just going to copy it on the below so that you have the two formats here. So get pizza, await. So instead of .then .catch, we say await make pizza. And so that means that I'm going to wait for this. And I'm going to store the result to something. So let's say result, await make pizza. And then I can simply continue with my code, don't have to put it inside any .then .catch. So please later for the error. So I can say that this part, I need to wait for it before I continue with what comes afterwards. So that means that it will wait for this before we see these other three pieces of information. And whenever we have an await inside the function, this function is considered an asynchronous function. So we also need to declare this function as asynchronous function. So this way and this way with the then, it's exactly the same. So if, let's say, we forget about the catch for now, or I will just put it in comment. And the promise doesn't change. The promise is always the same. It has a resolve and a reject part. We just put this to true so that we have the resolve only. It's the way that we deal with the promise. So we actually say that this is a promise. When this finishes, then do something and have the dot then block. And then all the code needs to be inside this callback function. So it needs to go inside this dot then, or a bit more clear is to say that wait for this and then the rest will happen. So wait and then these things will happen. And if I write now and call this get pizza wait, I will still see 1, 2, and then I get some pause, and then it waits for this, and we get this, and this, these other three pieces of information. So the response that I'm storing somewhere, if it is resolved correctly, and then the others. Both formats work, and so both are equivalent. If you prefer one or the other, it's up to you. Normally, there are many that are very passionate with async await. I think this is the most clear way of writing it. And since here we also expect that there may be also an error, so what earlier was the catch that we were putting to catch also the reject part. In the async await format, we put all of this inside a try catch block. So this part, we know that it may throw an error. So we put it inside a block that is called try. And then we have the catch part. And so catch, and then you catch the error if this has not been successful, and console log the error again. Okay, so let me see if we change this back to false. Let's see if we get the error. And then we did not get in the try part. Well, we tried to do that. It was not successful. And so we got in the catch part, and we just see this part, the error here. So these two are equivalent. Just that in one case, we have things happening inside callback functions, and callback functions are a bit more hard to read. So you see that this code is inside the parentheses of the then, and it's a callback function happening inside the then. And if for some reason in here you have some other promise, you will have to have a callback function inside the callback function and create something that's called like a callback help. And in this case, it seems a bit more clear because still it's line of code. It's like a separate line of code, and it's not like a callback function. So this would be the way to deal with promises if we don't want to get anything from any server. But now let's say that we want to get this same thing that we were getting here from the open weather map. So we have this same information and we want to catch it, to get it. So let's say that I'm going to create also a function, get weather. And it will try to get this information and show me something. Just show the temperature, console log the temperature. So my ultimate purpose is to get all this back and console log this temperature, what the weather will be like. So this function needs to connect to a server. And for that, I'm going to use the fetch method. And the fetch gets a URL inside. So in here, I need to put the URL that I'm going to try to connect to. So the URL in my case, with all the query parameters and everything, it's this one. Doing quotes, because it's a string, I pass the string URL to the fetch. And so again, I can use two ways. I can have the .n or the async await. But remember, we said for the fetch, let me just show you on the slides again. For the fetch that we said that it needs to have this double then. So normally a promise resolves and we have a then and a catch. But on the fetch, we need to do these two operations. So we need to first get the response from the promise. And then since the data is going to be in a kind of an unreadable format, we need to transform this to a JSON. And then we need to get the response from this promise, this second part, that will return us some kind of data. And we can, let's say, console log the whole data so that we just see it for now and see what happened. And we can also have a dot catch to catch. So if for some reason I couldn't connect to the server, then I will console log there. So let's call this get weather and see whether I get the data or the error, etc. So let me just put all this in comment. Okay, so the thing is that fetch is something that doesn't exist on Node. So Node, I cannot use it as I do it here. I need to use it inside the browser because if not, it's not working. So let me just put it inside an HTML. So I'm going to open the HTML. It needs to be from the browser. I cannot run it from the console. So let's say here on the script part, I just run this. And let me open this. And see the console here. So this is the function that I'm calling, the get weather, fetch. I'm doing this double then. So the first then it gets the response. If you want, we could also console log this response so that you can see what it includes. And then we have this processing of the response to transform it to JSON format, and we console log the data. Now we didn't have any error, so the part that we see here, it's actually the data. And you see it's in the format, we have seen it already in the Postman. It has information, clouds, coordinates, main, inside the main, it's this temperature that I may be wanting. So let's say that instead of the whole data, I want to console log this temperature. Instead of data then, which is this whole object, I need to go to data.main.temp to just see this temperature. So I could console log the temperature today is data.main.temp. And I just see this piece of information. So I don't need to show the whole object. I may need only parts of what the API responds to me. Or I just want to say, for example, that it's cloudy. So I just want to take the string that says cloudy, whatever I want from this part. So if I do something that's to create an error, to provoke an error. So let's say I put some extra letters in here so that the server doesn't exist. So that means that I get some error. So I see that we have failed to fetch. There is an error and name not resolved. And so I would need to be able to catch this error and show it. In fact, let me see if we get the unauthorized error. So the API, for example, this is my key. If I change the key, somehow I put maybe another or something, then I get this 401 error, unauthorized. So I should be able to see what is the status code and show it. Also depends on the need to process the different status codes and show it so that I know what has happened, what was the response from the error. So every time I get some response, even if it's not successful, I will get this response. Back what it was. And so we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to show you this same thing inside React, because actually for the activity, we want to do this. We want to do some kind of function to create this small function to fetch some data, just that instead of having it in an index HTML, we're going to have it inside React. But it's not different. We can use it as it is. We can call this function through some button or something from React. So let's say I have so here the rest of here we just have the app. We don't have any components for now. So we start with the React, we get some information, and here I have different URLs because it's for testing different things. This is not an issue. So inside here I have my React program. And I want to have one button, for example, let's say that when I click it, it calls this fetch function. Creating a button, it's as it was. So we create a button, and so we have fetch, and we create a button, and on click, we call this fetch function. And this fetch function, it calls so let me just clean this a bit. This is with the await syntaxes, not with the .then. I think I have with the .then here, so I'm just going to put with the .then. And I'm going to put this in comment. Just had both of them so that you can see it both with the await and also with the .then. So on clicking the button, I'm calling this, let's say, fetch data function. And what does it do? It fetches from a URL. The URL, I can copy it and have it in here, or I can have the URL somewhere up here defined. It's just a string. So I could simply copy the URL and put it in there, or have it defined somewhere up. If I want to try different URLs, I can have different ones here. And so I can fetch one, fetch the other. So it's easier. I don't have to copy all the time different ones. but if it's clear for you, you can also just copy the URL here. So this one, for example, it's from another API that gives me back some jokes, some programming jokes. So it's a different API. And instead of the weather, it gives me back some programming jokes. If I run this on Postman, I can see what I get back, the data. It's an array of different jokes. So this joke has a setup and a punchline and an ID. Setup, punchline. So they have this, it's more simple format. So it's a simple format, and it's nice also for checking, for doing some tests, because you don't have this nested, that it's a bit more complicated for beginners. So I'm fetching this, and then with the .then syntaxes, I'm getting the response, and then I'm processing this response back to JSON. Here, I also have some checking to see if the response code is not okay. Because when the server responds, even if it responds with the 400 something, this is not actually an error. So it will not go to the catch unless the server did not respond. Okay, so there is this peculiarity with the fetch, with the promise, that if the server responds, even if it responds with a 400, with unauthorized or something, it will not go to the catch because the promise has been fulfilled. It's supposed to be fulfilled because the server responded something. It was not rejected. So if I want to actually see what the server said, I need to check the status in here. So the response status check. So console log this response to see what you get from the server. Console log it to see it and see this response object as it is before you transform it to JSON. You will see you will get some information there. Maybe everything is okay. If not, you will need to just console log some error. But let's say that we suppose that we get the okay method. So let's forget that. We have with the fetch, we have this double dot, then we get the response, we pass it to JSON, and then we get the data and we do something with the data. We could console log it. Instead of this, I could simply console log the data. So when I call this, I have my get data, and I just console log it, and it's a big array with a lot of things happening in here. So with this punchline setup, etc. So these 10 jokes, I can simply console log the data. Or what will most probably happen in any program that you are running is that when you get the data, you will want to store it in some variable that you have. So you probably want to have some jokes variable that at the beginning is like an empty array, a state variable. And then when you get the data back from the server, you update this to hold the data. So you set jokes to this data. In this example. So I'm fetching, when I click the button, this function is called, and then I'm fetching some data, and then I process it, and then when I have my data, I store them, update my state variable, and I store them to my jokes variable. So when I have it stored here in my jokes variable, then I can do whatever I want. I can show them. It's an array of information. I can show them in my HTML, same as I would do with the map. So with the jokes.map, I can loop through this array and I can show everything. So if I actually call this with the get data, after a bit of a delay, just some milliseconds, I get the jokes, and then maybe I decide that I want to show just the text and in which format I want to show and everything. Okay, Do you understand, you get the process, or you want me to repeat how it's done? So we have this fetch. The fetch is only used for grabbing data. We can connect it with a button. So we have a button that when I click it, I get some data. And then this fetch function uses this fetch tool, this fetch method. We pass the URL of the API. It can be more simple. It can be with some queries, as we have seen in the Open Weather Map, where we have to put in here our API key, or latitude, longitude, etc. And then we deal with this data in this two double then format, for example. And when we finally get the data, we store it somewhere in our program. So in a state variable, we update one of our variables to store this data so that then we can show it, we can process it, loop through them, and deal with them.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So when it's connected, when the fetch function is connected to the button, every time you push the button, it'll fetch it and get that same API data again. Is that right?
Yes, so it will get different jokes because every time it gives you 10 random jokes, this API to create. But maybe another API, so the weather API will give you the same data, or if the weather has changed, so it will also give you different data. So yes, it will be updated.
Okay. I was just thinking like, if it's better to have the fetch like on a button or to put it with like a life cycle hook, so it would just get it and you could use it later.
You could load it if you want to load it like once at the beginning. You could put it inside the use effect. So inside the use effect, I think I have it. No, I don't have it here. So you could have that use effect inside the use effect. You call this fetch data function inside there so that it's loaded at the beginning automatically. You don't wait for the get data to be pushed. So now every time I push it, different jokes come, and so my state variable is updated and different jokes are showing. And this same way, we could do it with the async await. So instead of .then, .catch, if we want to do this with the async await, we need to, so I will do it in a function. It's easier. At the beginning, if you use the async await, it's easier if it's not an arrow function. So this function needs to be declared asynchronous because it means that in here, I'm going to be dealing with some waiting of data. And so you await the fetch. You await this part because you know that this part is going to take some time. It's going to return you a promise. So you await this, you store this to some response. And then this response needs to be transformed to a JSON. But transforming this to a JSON also takes some time. So you also have to wait for this and then store what this will respond to some data variable. And then set your, update your state variable to data. So if you want to use this await format, you would have to do it like this. Same as we have two thens, we will have two awaits. One await for waiting the fetch to happen, and one await for waiting the response JSON to finish. And so that we have our JSON format data, and then we can use this data. So we have two ways of writing it. The one that sounds clearer to you, you can use. And again, if we want to also catch errors, which is important, but it's true that at the beginning, we don't deal that much with errors because we try to focus on dealing with the normal part, but some error logging. So we have the catch error and maybe, I don't know, one sort of the error as well. So this would be the way of doing it with this async await format. The same thing as here. So try a bit, play a bit with it. We will need to do some reading. And so I'm going to pass you some resources as well. This code so that you can check that, because it's in React, but in fact, this code from React, it doesn't have anything. It's just a pattern and the mapping of the results that I get. I know from the result that there is something that is called a setup and a punchline, because I have checked it like on the Postman, and I know that I get as a response an object with this and this other. So I'm using this to show the data as I want in my app. So here, when I map these jokes, maybe I have this item setup and this item punchline. But this is because I am already previously checking it on the Postman and see it. And then maybe I need to also keep the error somewhere. So if I'm expecting some error, I could do some error handling, keep the error. And if there is an error, so I conditionally show the error and instead of the data. So also I could keep this error instead of just simply console logging it. I use another state variable for keeping the error and showing it also, so that if an error is happening, the user knows what has happened. So let's say if I try different, so this one, it will not work. I think it will give me an error. Because I have added some extra letters in here. So when I do the get data, I get the error here, but I would actually need to store the error maybe in a variable and also show it up here, because the user is not going to be checking the console, right? The user needs to show something like an error has happened. Even if it is an error has happened, you need to show something up here for the user when an error is happening. The user is not going to be checking the console. So what we can do is when an error is happening, we also store it to some state variable and show it up here on the HTML or the template part. Okay, so we have, in fact, I have here like an error variable. And then with the set error, I can update it, store what error I have received, and then show this error to the user. Okay, I'm going to pass you a clean version of this so that you have a bit with the two formats, so that you have it a bit so that you can study it. And sorry, the link for the activity. Sorry for taking a bit too long today. There are many things, and we didn't really have finished with everything, but anyway. Resources. So this is the link for the activity. It is the code, as I said, is in React. If you are feeling confident with Vue and you want to try it with Vue, it is okay, because the part that it's just, I mean, there is a function, the fetch function, that it can be done either in React or in Vue. It doesn't matter. You need just to practice a bit this fetching of the APIs. It can either be a method in Vue or a function in React. Okay. Other questions? I have some resources also. I will pass you for loaders. These are nice, but this is optional, and I think you need to practice first. There are quite a lot of things, and we need to practice first dealing with the fetch. So this provides some nice ways, like very visual, of when your page is loading and you want to inform the user that the page is loading, and you can check the code and it's actually just CSS. So you could copy this in your CSS, and if you add this part in your HTML, then this one will be showing when it's loading. So I think this is like a next step. I can pass it along with an example for those that they feel that the other part they can do quickly and they want to play a bit with the loader. So I can pass you some example for the loader. But yes, this is totally like a bonus or temporary optional thing. So read a bit about the fetch, play with Postman, with different APIs. I'm going to pass you also a list of APIs that are free for practice so that you can check the different ones that exist. And yes, so let's see. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions because this structure is a bit hard at the beginning, but then you get used to either one or the other. And we will work with Fetch a lot to be able to work with databases and with data. Comments, questions? Okay, let's get to work, and I'll see you on